So for this section, Michael Gordon and I from our product management team are going to go through some of the VxRail advantage with regards to the management of a VxRail cluster. And to go through that, when we look at the VxRail management side, I'm actually going to go through a demo. So when we log into the environment, first what we'll do is we'll go through an environment overview, talk a little bit about the vCenter deployment options, and then talk a little about some of the VxRail Manager functionality, whether it's viewing clusters and nodes, scaling the cluster, or anything along those lines. And then Michael is going to come in and talk a little bit about our multi-cluster management. So for the sake of time, let's jump right into the demo environment. So here we've got in our demo environment, basically a set of VxRail clusters. So if we start up here at the top, one of the nice things about VxRail Manager and the way that we've integrated the workflows of VxRail Manager is that it's all done through a plugin native within vCenter itself. So when we do the VxRail administration side, we don't have to worry about leaving vCenter to do any of the administration. In this system here, what we have is I basically have 3 clusters, each of them with 4 VxRail nodes. So we can see we've got a cluster here, 4 VxRail nodes, vCenter, and a VxRail Manager VM. Then we've got a second cluster of 4 nodes down below in the middle, and then all the way at the bottom, another set of 4 nodes. You'll notice that each cluster does have a VxRail Manager virtual machine, right? So as Curtis was talking about through the demo process itself, the config portal, every cluster gets a VxRail Manager VM. And that's how we're able to do the cluster operations of scaling it, replacing drives, upgrading the code that Daniel was talking about earlier. And it's all done through vCenter. One of the nice things about the VxRail Manager VM itself, though, is it is a single VM per cluster, and it's static from a resource perspective. So as we add nodes, add feature functionality to the cluster, we do not have to spin up additional VxRail Manager virtual machines, nor do we have to allocate additional CPU or memory to that virtual machine itself. We also, if we look at this, if I just minimize here, you'll see we have 2 vCenters that are basically in linked mode from that perspective. That's one of the newer things that we added in the 7.0 versions of VxRail to help with the multi-cluster management. So if we look at the basis of a VxRail deployment, if you will, from a vCenter architecture, there's basically 2 branches that we look at. The first branch is the VxRail managed and deployed vCenter instance. And then the other one is a non-VxRail managed and deployed vCenter instance. For the VxRail deployed, you may see it referred to as the internal vCenter, the embedded vCenter. I like to refer to it as the VxRail deployed and managed vCenter, because as we look at this architecture, there's a couple things that we can do. There are some things that have changed with our 7.0 release. The first thing is we can actually take the VxRail managed deployed vCenter, which we see one here in this first cluster, and then we see one down here at the bottom on the third cluster, and we can actually put those into a linked mode relationship. In previous versions of VxRail, it was always one-to-one. So if you had a VxRail manager deployed vCenter, it was one vCenter for one VxRail cluster. And they were kind of on their own islands of management, if you will. We now have opened up the capabilities of, during deployment, joining those VxRail deployed vCenter instances to the same SSO, so we can do linked mode to help with management at scale. We also support that as a day 2 operation now as well, where if a customer had deployed at 4.7, which is based off of vSphere 6.7, and then upgraded to a 7.0 release, we can then, or they can then join them and create that linked mode relationship. The other thing that we changed in the 7.0 code frame is the ability for this VxRail deployed and managed vCenter to manage other VxRail clusters. So if we look at this middle cluster here, you'll notice we have some VMs running on it. We have our VxRail Manager VM, as I mentioned. However, there is not a vCenter instance that's running native inside of that cluster itself. And that's because with that VxRail deployed and managed vCenter instance, we do have the capability of managing multiple VxRail clusters. Right? So when we look at VxRail management at scale, this is a great way to help customers that are going down the path of VxRail and everything's kind of contained within the VxRail ecosystem, if you will, and they can log into one vCenter if they're in link mode relationships and see each of their VxRail clusters wherever they may be inside the data center. The advantage of this architecture as well is that during that lifecycle management operation that was previously discussed, VxRail Manager will update the vCenter instance. So you get some of that functionality of that full lifecycle management of the entire stack itself. Now, if we focus briefly on the other architecture that we support from a vCenter architecture perspective, is we can also deploy a VxRail cluster into an existing customer's vCenter infrastructure. So if they already have vCenter up and running and they just want to seamlessly integrate that VxRail cluster into it, during that deployment, as Curtis highlighted in the configuration portal, we basically tell VxRail Manager in the configuration side, go ahead and join this existing vCenter instance. We need to make sure we have a user with the correct roles specified in that vCenter instance, and we need to make sure that there's a data center that exists. If once those things are defined, VxRail Manager during the automation of the deployment will automatically create the cluster, create the nodes, our distributed virtual switch, so on and so forth in that environment. And that can allow customers with larger scale VMware environments that aren't just VxRail focused to have that single management plane to manage their entire VMware environment. Now, when we look at the VxRail Manager piece, so as we mentioned, there's one VxRail Manager VM per cluster. If we click on menu, this is where you first kind of see VxRail, and it's sort of the plugin integration. So if I click on VxRail and then come down and let's look at, we can let it sit on this cluster. If we let it look at this cluster here, we basically get a dashboard. And this is a great way for you as end users to get a quick view into the environment. We can see our overall system health. We can get into some of the support site if we need to contact support, or potentially do a download of that composite package or that validated state offline, so we can supply that to VxRail as part of the lifecycle piece. And then also over here on the right-hand side, you can also see we have our links to our VxRail community, and then also the VxRail knowledge base. So you can natively search the VxRail knowledge base right here from within vCenter, as opposed to going up to the support site. Now, this is for this one specific cluster. If I come up here, we can also click in the drop-down, and since we have two vCenter instances in a linked relationship, I can click on the second cluster here, and I can toggle between the two VxRail clusters that are associated, I should say, with that vCenter instance, and we can see that this one is healthy as well.
Is there a limitation, Jeremy, to the amount of VxRail that you can have in this dashboard?
No, we would follow the same vCenter maximums from that side. So it would be 15 vCenters in a linked mode relationship, and then however many nodes or clusters for the specified version of vCenter. So when we looked at some of the administration side of VxRail, it's really done at the host and clusters view, and it's mainly done at the cluster level. There are some things we can do in other areas of vCenter, but I would say 90%-ish or so, as just a guess, of the administration is really done at the cluster level. And when we look at it, if we start here on the monitor tab and we scroll down, you'll see that there's a VxRail section in this vertical menu across the middle. Right? So if we click on appliances, this is going to show us a physical representation of each one of the nodes that make up the cluster. So each one of these nodes that's represented underneath the cluster on the left-hand side of the hosts and clusters view, we have a correlating appliance or node, if you will, over here on the right. Across the top, we get the cluster-wide information. And I can also click on one of these nodes and get information about the node, that one specific node. So we can see our PSNT, which is what we traditionally use on the VxRail side for the serial number. You can also see we call out or we specify what the ESXi and IDRAC IP addresses are set to. And these are also linked. So if we needed to get into the host client or into IDRAC, you can click on those right here from within vCenter. And then there's also some alerts that VxRail Manager is triggering. Typically, you'll see those alerts with a VXR prefix. These two alerts I like to have in our lab environment, especially when we're showing VxRail off to customers, because these alerts are actually defined within the vCenter alarm definitions. So, for our larger customers that may have vCenter sending SNMP traps or SMTP emails, they can go into their alarm definitions. And these two specifically, I recommend customers look at, because when we want to do an upgrade, if we don't want to sit and just monitor the upgrade from within vCenter, we can have vCenter send an alert that basically says, hey, the upgrade has started, and then there's a corresponding alert for the upgrade has completed. So that allows administrators, so they don't have to sit here in vCenter and just kind of watch the lifecycle management. They can look at their alerting and monitoring, or if they're getting emails, look at their emails and just kind of say, yep, node 1 started, 45, 60 minutes later, node 1 completed, now node 2 has started, and it gives them a quick and easy way to track the upgrades of the system itself. We can also click on actions, and there are a couple different actions we can see here. The first one we'll click on is viewing the host details. So this will actually, if you look at it, it changed our view or our selection on the left-hand side to an individual host. And then underneath monitor and VxRail, we have a physical view. And now we have a zoomed in view, if you will, of just this one specific node. So if we wanted to drill into the individual components of that node, like the capacity or the cache drives, it's interactive. So we can click on a drive, get information about that drive itself. If there are any alerts, we could see the alerts here. If we wanted to replace the drive, we could turn on the LED, and then we can also walk through a wizard kind of workflow, if you will, to replace that disk, where VxRail Manager will just walk the customer through next, remove the old drive, insert the new drive, next, and the system will go through and do what's required to replace either that cache or capacity drive from a vSAN perspective. We can also click on NICs, get information about the individual NIC ports. So this node happens to have two 25 gig NICs inside of them. We can see our firmware version. We can see the driver version. And then while we're talking about versions, if we look over here on the right-hand side, you'll also see callouts for our firmware and component versions. One of the nice benefits of this is this allows customers to see this information very easily and very quickly. However, as Daniel talked about with the continuously validated state that we put out, they don't necessarily need to worry about going out and tracking each one of these versions down, right? So this is a great way that you can get a view into the environment and see, hey, what version BIOS am I running? What version BMC or iDRAC am I running on this node? So that you have a quick and easy view as an administrator into those versions. Now, just a couple other things to call out here as well is the bulk of the operations are really done at the cluster level, and if we select configure across the top. Underneath VxRail, you can see this is really where we see most of the options and operations that we can interact with. If you click on system, it's basically going to give you the about. So this happens to be running VxRail version 7.0.202, which is the current latest GA version of VxRail itself. When we go to do the updates, as Daniel had highlighted, we would come underneath VxRail and do the update screen, and you would have the option here of, again, getting information about the current version and some of the component and versions that are running on the system itself. And then we have the option of doing either an internet update or a local update, right? And when we look at each of these, the internet update, I actually have a cluster up here. Let's just jump up to this one here real quick. When we look at the internet update, you'll actually see that on this cluster, since it's not at the latest, it'll actually show us the latest version of the VxRail system that's available. And then we'd be able to do an update. Or if we wanted to go to maybe an N-1 version or a different version than the most recent, we could do a local update. And that's where we could click on browse and point the system to the specific version that we had downloaded itself. Let's just jump back to this cluster. There are a couple options in here that I won't cover specifically. Oops, not that one, this one. That I won't mention specifically, but they're specific to the VxRail Manager VM. So things like certificate. If we needed to replace the certificates on the VxRail Manager VM, you can do that natively from within vCenter. Or if a customer wanted to, they could SSH to the VxRail Manager VM and do that via CLI, but this definitely makes it much, much easier. When we look at hosts, this is one of the things that VxRail Manager helps facilitate. As the question was asked earlier during the deployment, we're locked in, or we can deploy anywhere from 3 to 6 hosts. What if we had more hosts? Well, what we could do is we could come up here to the host screen, we could click on add, and if we had additional hosts available to be added, they would show up down here at the bottom if they were doing the automatic discovery using that loudmouth process over IPv6, or if we needed to add them manually using an IPv4 address, we could click on add and specify that information in that screen there. And then the system would walk the user through essentially defining the host name, defining the IP addresses for the management IP for vSAN, vMotion, so on and so forth. And then it goes to the same thing that Curtis highlighted, where it would validate to make sure we can add this host successfully or host to the cluster. And then when it's done validating, we'd be able to click on add and non-disruptively scale out the cluster right from this view itself. If we click on a node, we also have workflows to edit if we needed to change our ESXi host name or management IP, or also to remove the node. Right? One of the big benefits of VxRail and HCI is we could scale the cluster up, for instance, with the 15G base nodes that we have. And then if the other older nodes were coming up off of maintenance, we would then be able to remove those nodes. One other thing to highlight real quick is with regards to management as well, is VxRail Manager does have Swagger integration. So a lot of the tasks that we can perform from that VxRail Manager plugin inside vCenter, there are corresponding APIs associated with that. So if we just open up a simple browser tab to the IP address of your VxRail Manager VM, and then add on the extension of REST VXRM API doc.htm, you can then come in and look at the different API definitions that are available to us, and you would be able to walk through and have that interactive API session with the VxRail Manager VM. And this can help you, if we click on try it out, it can help you build out those API queries commands as well. The last thing that I wanted to highlight is the support aspect of it, right? So from the support side, you can see here we can contact support. We have full support for SRS, so some of those VxRail triggered alerts can enable that proactive dial home capability so that the system can dial home, open up an SR, and go through that workflow that we have available to us on our storage systems as well. And then we can also get into what we're going to talk about in a second, and Mike's going to talk about. Customers also have the ability to get into the SaaS multi-cluster management, which is that cloud web-based portal that customers have access to, where they can view all of their VxRail clusters from that single cloud-based portal itself.
Thanks, Jeremy. What I want to talk about first, and again, point out really quick, is VxRail has been integrated into CloudIQ as of April 8th of this year. Susan presented yesterday a comprehensive demo of CloudIQ and the management of the objects within CloudIQ, storage as well. I'm not going to do a demo today, obviously, because she did a great job in presenting, how to go through and evaluate the health scores, as well as look at the capacity and do some analytics in terms of identifying problems. But what I do want to point out again is that VxRail is integrated in CloudIQ to present the proactive health scores, to be able to evaluate short-term and long-term capacity planning. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do here is provide a single pane of glass to monitor the products within the Dell portfolio across the data center. So I want to briefly talk about SaaS Active Multi-Cluster Management. What that is the ability to actively manage multiple clusters from a single pane of glass. When I say manage, what I'm talking about is the ability to pre-check clusters to validate that the clusters are ready for upgrade. Once they're pre-checked, then we have the ability to download the software locally, and then finally execute the upgrades from this single pane of glass. And this can be done all on multiple clusters. The important part of what we've done here in terms of the upgrade process is that we provide a optimized download capability to allow the cluster bundles or the software bundles to be transmitted from the source to the destination. Only those bits that have changed between the source and destination are updated and transmitted over the network. This optimizes the time it takes to do an update for individual clusters. The status can be shown for all the clusters, as you can see here. They're monitored as part of the jobs framework. And then with pre-checks, provides a report of all the tests that have been executed, whether they've passed, failed, and then admins can go through and look at this report and fix problems before they actually execute the updates. These reports can be filtered and exported and include remediation steps. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I know this was pretty quick, but if you do have any additional questions, we can take those now, either Jeremy or I.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So this might be controversial, but this is for VxRail specifically, but it seems like this would be really good for any clusters that are running HCI from a Dell perspective. So is there one similar available for customers who aren't taking advantage of the pre-built and everything done for you VxRail version?
No, it's just for the VxRail clusters only. Cloud IQ itself plans on extending this multi-cluster update capability to the other products within the Dell portfolio, to those products where it makes sense, not all of them, but those products that can take advantage.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
So who can do that one? So a lot of customers, because it's VMware driven, right? So a lot of customers will probably have something like vRealize Operations Manager or something like that. How does that cooperate with what you're doing with Cloud IQ and the VxRail side of things?
Yeah, so VROPS does have, it's complementary. So Cloud IQ is complementary to VROPS. When you look at Cloud IQ and the analytics that it provides, it's at the hardware level, okay? And it also provides the capability of updating the hardware. The virtual layer itself can be monitored not only through Cloud IQ, but also VROPS. VROPS obviously has a more comprehensive telemetry and a lot more details in terms of what can be analyzed. But again, the expectation is to use Cloud IQ as the first level of inspection and observation, as well as problem identification. And then if additional debug or troubleshooting is required, if VROPS is available, then they should use those to debug the virtual environment, virtual layer.